Hey there, welcome to Black Gumbo Southern Gardening. Today we're going to talk about 7 common mistakes that tomato gardeners make. These are the most common mistakes of all. We'll walk you through them. You can see that it's very, very humid here today because my lens is a little bit foggy and I can't keep it clear until the temperature of that camera stabilizes. You just have to deal with fog. Look at all these tomatoes I've got growing behind me. They're huge. They're getting out of control. How do you get good, healthy tomato production? Well, first of all, the first thing you don't do is buy tomato plant starts that already have blossoms or fruit on them. A lot of people think, wow, I could get a head start if I buy that plant. Instead, buy starts that are short, little, young guys. That's the best way. If you're not starting your own seeds and you want to go and buy tomatoes from the big box store, that's a great way to get it done, but don't get the ones that have the tomatoes on them. What that means is that plant feels stressed. It's a stressed out plant and it's hurrying to finish its reproduction cycle. It wants to produce fruit and seeds before it dies. So a plant senses that it's too big for its britches. The roots are probably root bound and it's trying to rush. It shouldn't be making fruit in a little bitty pot like that. So buy the little guys, make sure they look healthy, good dark green little tomato plants. You'll have a good start that way. The next mistake that many tomato gardeners make is planting in too small of a pot. If you're going to plant in a pot, you want to make sure that you get a good sized pot. This is the smallest I'll do. I'll maybe do a 5-gallon pot if I know it's a small plant. But this is about a 10-gallon pot. I really don't know, but I mean, you could just eyeball it. Basically, if your plant is in this much soil, it's probably going to have a good chance of producing tomatoes and running through its life cycle. This is a determinant. It's only going to get so big and it's only going to produce so many tomatoes and then it's done. And this is the perfect pot size for that. But if you put an indeterminate in here, you're going to have to keep it trimmed. And yeah, these are about the size I'll go for a tomato plant. You can do a 5-gallon bucket. You could maybe even get away with a smaller bucket or pot if you fertilize properly and you irrigate properly, because those small pots tend to dry out quicker and they're just difficult. It's just hard. Get a bigger pot. The larger amount of soil that you use will be more stable for your plant. The third mistake that gardeners often make planting tomatoes, especially in pots, is they put too many plants in a pot. 1 plant per pot. That's the rule. If you put more plants in that soil, you're basically doing the same thing as if you use too small a pot. There's not enough soil to support 2 different plants. These tomato plants' root systems will fill that entire container, and you don't want them competing with one another for moisture, for nutrients. 1 plant per pot will give you a generous harvest of tomatoes. And if you want to have more plants, buy some more pots or acquire some more soil somewhere, but don't crowd them out. The only exception to this that I believe I would do is if I'm growing dwarf varieties, you know, the kinds that the whole plant's about the size of a basketball and that's about it. Then with plants like that, sure, you can put them 2 or 3 to a pot. But on a regular sized tomato, like this one here, 1 per pot. The next mistake that I've done it myself, and I see new gardeners especially making this mistake, is planting tomato plants too close together. When I put these in, I spaced them about 3 feet apart. Typically 4 feet would be even better. And when you put a little plant in the garden at that spacing, it looks like you're wasting a lot of space. But I've let these go for 2 weeks without pruning so I could show you what happens when these plants, when they grow big. These are all indeterminate types and they're touching. They've already filled in the space in between the plants and they're touching. And well, that's not ideal. You want good airflow. You want to keep these trimmed up and you want to keep them apart from one another. So I really need to get out here and prune these plants. Don't plant them so close together. Plant them far enough where their roots can range out and they can harvest the soil of nutrients and you'll get good tomatoes. Again, take a look at the spacing here. We've got 3 feet between these plants. We've got a little less between these 2. I was planning on keeping these a little more trimmed. But you can see I've just got a jungle here. It's a productive jungle. And I've got leaf-footed bugs in there I got to get rid of, but it's a productive jungle. And yeah, if I'd have spaced them a little better, I could manage this a little better, but hey, sometimes pruning gets away from you. That brings us to our next mistake that tomato gardeners often make. The next mistake that people often make is improper pruning or not pruning at all. Here is an example of letting an indeterminate variety go for a couple of weeks without pruning. You can see all of these main growing vines. Well, they're growing, and this plant is out of control. You might be hesitant to prune because you say, well, this main vine here has fruit on it. Well, you'll get fruit regardless. You might not get as much, but that's why you have a couple of plants rather than one big out of control plant. I have a whole video on how to prune tomato plants, and I'll link that right here. Well, it's already super hot here. Summer's really starting to set in, and I know it's not the time to start tomatoes in my area, but in more northern climates it might be time. And that's another mistake people often make, is planting tomatoes at the wrong time of the season. Tomatoes require temperatures between around 70, 75 degrees all the way up to about 85 degrees in order for the pollen to be viable. And if you don't have viable pollen, if it's too hot or if it's too cool, then your tomatoes aren't going to produce any fruit. They'll grow, but they won't produce too much fruit. So you have to watch your timing, and the way you do this is you check with your local extension office, or you get online and you find out, what grows at what time in my area. And oftentimes your county extension office will publish a chart saying, this is the time for tomatoes, this is the time for beans, this is the time for whatever it is. And there's a spring season and a fall season for tomatoes. Some of these tomatoes will make it through the summer. There are varieties that go through the heat of our summers. That Edox cherry tomato that's out of control back there, they go through the summer quite nicely. Some of these tomatoes are just going to give up and die when the heat comes on, and especially when the humidity comes. I've already got some humidity issues going on with some of my plants. And yeah, so mark the timing, check out what grows in your area when it's right to grow tomatoes, because tomatoes don't grow year-round in most climates. You have to time them. So that's the mistake a lot of people make. I see people going to the store buying tomato plants. Like right now in my area, it's too late. You're not going to get any tomatoes, so be mindful of that. Finally, the last mistake that tomato gardeners often make is they don't have proper support for their tomato plants. If you're growing a determinate bush type, you don't really need a bunch of support. Maybe a stake, maybe a couple of stakes you tie your plant to when it gets heavy. But if you're growing an indeterminate type, that's this kind of plant that'll just grow and get out of control. You need some kind of support. Tomato plants like this naturally sprawl across the ground. And if they touch the ground, all our varieties that we grow, they're so far removed from being wild plants that they're prone to diseases, and lots of diseases are taken up through the soil. So you want to support your plants. At the bare minimum, a tomato cage. But a tomato cage is only good so far as you maintain it. You maintain the trellising of your tomato in here and the pruning of your tomato. I'll show you a mistake that I've made right here on this plant. Check out this branch. This branch just came right out of the base there, and I didn't prune it. I forgot to get this one. And look, I've got heavy fruit sitting on the ground. Yeah, that's not a good situation. Ideally, I'd come and trim this whole branch off and count that as a loss. I've got plenty of fruit coming in on this plant elsewhere. But I think what I'm going to do is, since it's not sitting directly on the soil, since it's sitting on this weed cloth, I'm going to let those tomatoes start to blush. Then I'll pick them, then I'll prune this off. And while you're trellising your tomatoes, you just take them when they're growing and you just direct them like so. You direct them so that the main growing vines are inside the cage, and that'll work for you. Here's one I didn't get, and it's going all the way over to my other cage over there. So yeah, correct trellising is a very good practice. It helps you get a lot of fruit. It keeps your plants healthy. And yeah, that's not a good example of what to do. Well, there we have some common mistakes that gardeners often make when growing tomatoes, especially if you're new to growing tomatoes. Now, we could talk about tomatoes for a long time and not exhaust all the tips and tricks. If you'd like to learn how to grow tomatoes, check out my channel and subscribe. This year especially, I've done almost all tomato videos, how to start them, how to propagate them, how to prune them, how to plant them, you name it. We're talking tomatoes this year. So head over to my channel or go down below and subscribe if you haven't already. Hey, if you'd like to support our channel, I have a new Amazon shop where I sell I suggest to you the items that I actually use. I've used them, I like them, and people are often asking me, hey, how can I get that? Check my link below. Hey, thanks for joining me on Black Gumbo Southern Gardening. I hope you have happy gardening. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.